Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a figure who embodies both dazzling talent and head-scratching controversy. Barbra Streisand.
Right.
She's a legend,
Yeah.
a philanthropist, and let's face it, a bit of a lightning rod for strong opinions.
Oh, yeah.
So the question we're digging into is this. Is she a true visionary? A master manipulator?
Oh.
Or somewhere in between, grifter or gifted? You sent us a fascinating mix of sources, articles, website profiles, even financial filings,
Wow.
giving us a 360 view of her career and her causes.
It's an intriguing case, isn't it? Because on the surface, you see this incredible generosity. The Barbra Streisand Foundation, which she started back in 1986, has given away over $25 million to over 800 organizations. But as we dig deeper, the line between altruism and self-promotion starts to blur.
Okay, so let's rewind for a second before we get into the philanthropy. We've got to talk about something that's become almost synonymous with Barbra, the Streisand Effect.
Oh, yeah.
It's not every day you have a global phenomenon named after you.
Right. It's a perfect example of how trying to control information can backfire spectacularly, especially in the internet age. Think back to the early 2000s.
Okay.
Streisand was trying to suppress an aerial photo of her Malibu mansion. It was part of a public coastal erosion project, so technically anyone could access it. But she filed a $50 million lawsuit to have it removed.
And that's where things get wild. Before the lawsuit, barely anyone had even seen the photo. But once the news hit, it went viral.
Yeah.
And guess what? To this day, that very same photo is still on the California Coastal Records website.
It's fascinating because it speaks to a certain personality trait, wouldn't you say? The harder she pushes to control the narrative, the more attention it draws. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right, so we see this pattern of control emerging early on. But let's shift gears to her philanthropic work.
Okay.
You mentioned that her foundation has a vast reach, supporting over 800 organizations. What kinds of causes are we talking about?
Well, you see a pretty diverse range. Women's rights, environmental issues, Jewish causes. She's supported big names like the William J. Clinton Foundation and the Environmental Defense Fund, but also lesser-known groups like Consumer Watchdog and the Sandy Hook Promise. She even donated Gianna Floyd's Disney shares in 2020 after George Floyd's tragic death.
That was quite a spectrum.
Yeah.
But it makes me wonder, does all this giving truly align with her publicly stated values? Or is there something else at play here? Especially considering that her foundation doesn't accept unsolicited proposals. It's by invitation only.
That's a crucial detail, isn't it? It suggests a very carefully curated approach to philanthropy. It's not just about helping anyone in need. It's about supporting causes that fit a very specific vision.
And that vision seems to align pretty closely with her own political leanings. From the sources you provided, it's clear that Streisand is openly and actively political, mostly supporting liberal causes and candidates.
Absolutely. We see her supporting Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, even writing a song against Donald Trump. And this is where the whole debate about Hollywood influence on elections comes in. Do celebrities like Streisand have too much sway simply because of their wealth and platform?
We even have some contrasting viewpoints in the sources. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, for example, claims Streisand and Ryan Reynolds basically fled to a safer district to try and influence an election.
It's a complicated issue. On one hand, you could argue that wealthy individuals, regardless of their profession, have the right to support the causes they believe in. But on the other hand, you have to wonder if their influence can disproportionately impact the outcome of elections.
Definitely something for you, our listener, to consider. We're seeing a pattern here. Talent, generosity, and a strong desire to control the narrative. But what happens when that control slips? Let's dive into the less glamorous side of Barbra Streisand. The controversies and the diva reputation that has followed her for decades.
Ah, yes. The stories are legendary. From feuds with fellow actors like Jane Fonda and Walter Matthau to public clashes with directors, she's certainly not afraid to ruffle feathers.
And it's not just behind-the-scenes drama. Some of these stories are almost hard to believe.
Right.
There's one where she allegedly bit a co-star's neck on stage after an extramarital affair gone wrong.
It's a reminder that public image and private behavior don't always align, and it makes you wonder, do these incidents tarnish her philanthropic image? Do they suggest a pattern of self-serving behavior? That contradicts her carefully crafted persona.
It's a valid question, and there are more recent examples that raise eyebrows too, like her comments about Michael Jackson's accusers, where she seemed to question why parents would let their children sleep over at his house.
It sparked a huge backlash, with many accusing her of victim blaming and defending a known abuser. It definitely painted her in a less than favorable light. especially in today's climate of heightened awareness around abuse and power dynamics.
So we're left with this complex picture. A woman who advocates for women's rights, but also exhibits behavior that some might consider controlling and even insensitive. It's like these two sides of her personality are constantly at odds.
It's a fascinating tension, isn't it? And it speaks to a larger question that often arises when we examine figures like Barbra Streisand. Can you separate the art from the artist? Can you appreciate their talent and contributions while still acknowledging their flaws and problematic actions?
And how does that separation, or lack thereof, influence our perception of their motives? Does it taint our view of their philanthropy, or are we able to compartmentalize those different aspects of their lives?
It's a subjective question, and there's no right or wrong answer, but I think it's important to be aware of our own biases and how they might shape our judgments. It's easy to fall into the trap of idolizing celebrities or demonizing them based on isolated incidents.
That's true, and I think it's worth noting that Streisand has never shied away from expressing her opinions, even when they've been unpopular.
Right.
She's spoken out about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, even though it's a highly sensitive, divisive issue.
And she's faced criticism from both sides of the political spectrum for her stance, but it does demonstrate a certain level of conviction and a willingness to engage in difficult conversations, even if it means alienating some of her fans.
So maybe it's less about control and more about authenticity, however messy that might be. She's not trying to please everyone, she's just being true to herself, even if it rubs some people the wrong way.
It's an interesting interpretation, and it brings us back to the core question. Is Barbra Streisand ultimately a grifter or a gifted individual?
We've seen her use her platform to raise millions for charity. We've seen her speak out against injustice and advocate for causes she believes in, but we've also seen her make questionable comments and engage in behavior that has alienated many.
The evidence is there, both for and against her. And I think it's important for our listeners to draw their own conclusions based on the information we've presented.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as we move towards our final thoughts, I think it's important to address one more aspect of Streisand's legacy.
Okay.
The Barbra Streisand Institute at UCLA. This is a brand new initiative focused on researching solutions to some of the most pressing issues of our time: climate change, social justice, truthfulness in public discourse.
It's a significant investment, and it seems to align with her stated commitment to making a positive impact on the world. It's fascinating that she chose to focus on these specific areas, which have been recurring themes in her work and activism throughout her career.
But it's also interesting to note that the institute is named after her. Does this suggest a genuine desire to use her wealth and influence for good? Or is it another example of her need for recognition and control, even in her philanthropic endeavors?
It's a question worth pondering. On one hand, you could argue that naming the institute after herself helps raise its profile and attract attention to these important issues. On the other hand, it does raise the question of ego and legacy.
Is it about the impact she wants to make on the world? Or is it about ensuring that her name is remembered and associated with these noble causes? It's a subtle but important distinction.
And it brings us back to the complexity of human motivation. Are our actions ever purely altruistic, or are they always intertwined with some degree of self-interest? It's a question that philosophers have debated for centuries, and there's no easy answer.
But maybe that's the point of this deep dive. It's not about finding a definitive answer. It's about wrestling with the ambiguities and contradictions that make up a human life, especially one as multifaceted as Barbra Streisand's. It feels like with Barbra Streisand, even when she's trying to do good, there's this shadow of self-interest lurking in the background. Is that too cynical a take?
Not necessarily. I think it's natural to question motives, especially when dealing with individuals who have a history of self-promotion and a desire for control. But it's also important to acknowledge that good intentions and self-interest aren't mutually exclusive. It's possible to be driven by both.
So how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory aspects of her personality? On one hand, we see this passionate advocate for social justice, environmental causes, and women's rights. On the other hand, we see someone who can be remarkably tone-deaf and insensitive, even when she's trying to make a positive impact.
It's a puzzle, isn't it? And I think it speaks to the broader challenge of evaluating public figures in a nuanced way. We tend to gravitate towards simplistic narratives, hero or villain, saint or sinner, but the reality is often much more complicated.
And with someone like Streisand, who has been in the public eye for decades, there are layers upon layers of perception and interpretation. How much of what we see is genuine, and how much is carefully constructed image management.
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it's worth considering the possibility that she truly believes in the causes she supports, even if her approach is sometimes flawed or tinged with self-interest.
So maybe it's not about labeling her as a grifter or a saint, but rather about recognizing the complexities and contradictions that make her such a fascinating and enduring figure.
Exactly, and I think that's a valuable takeaway for our listeners. When you encounter someone who seems larger than life, someone who evokes strong emotions, both positive and negative, resist the urge to jump to easy conclusions. Take the time to delve deeper, to examine their actions and their words from multiple perspectives.
Because ultimately, that's the goal of the deep dive. It's not about providing definitive answers, but about encouraging critical thinking and nuanced discussion.
And hopefully, by examining the lives and legacies of individuals like Barbra Streisand, we can gain a better understanding of ourselves and the complex world we inhabit.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with this final thought. Embrace the ambiguity. Resist the urge to categorize people into neat little boxes. Acknowledge the good and the bad, the inspiring and the frustrating. And remember that even the most polarizing figures are ultimately human, with all the flaws and complexities that entails. Until next time, keep diving.